Every teacher, every book, every mentor told Alexander exactly who to be. He listened. Then he burned the lesson down and walked toward the horizon anyway. That's not rebellion. That's the only honest thing a person can do. Look, I want to tell you something about Alexander the Great that most history classes skip entirely. You know the story. Brilliant general, conquered Persia, pushed all the way to India, died young, blah, blah, blah. That's the highlight reel. And it's real. I'm not saying it isn't. But here's the thing. Somewhere between child prodigy tutored by Aristotle and dead at 32 in a Babylonian palace, there's this other story, a weirder one. The story of a man who gave away everything he owned before a major campaign because a philosopher dared him to, who sat face to face with the Diogenes. You know, the guy who lived in a barrel and told people to their face that they were idiots, and didn't execute him. He admired him, who cried publicly for days when his best friend died. That's not the portrait of a conqueror. That's the portrait of someone in serious philosophical pain. And once you see it that way, the entire conquest looks completely different. Here's the conventional read on Alexander. He wanted power, he wanted glory, he was trained to conquer, and he was good at it, so he kept going. That explanation is lazy, and it doesn't hold up. Because Aristotle, the man who spent 3 years inside this kid's head, taught him something that Alexander spent his entire adult life systematically dismantling. Aristotle believed in a clean division, Greeks on one side, everyone else on the other. Civilized and barbarian, us and them. Alexander heard that lesson. Then he watched Persian noblemen govern their own cities under his rule. He wore Persian robes, he learned to speak to soldiers in their own languages. He married a Bactrian woman from modern-day Afghanistan and encouraged his generals to do the same. His word for what he was building was homonoia, unity, a single human community that didn't care where you were born. That's not a warlord's agenda, that's a philosopher's project wearing armor. And it cost him everything politically. His Macedonian generals hated it. They mutinied. They called him soft, corrupted, foreign. Men who'd followed him for a decade spat at the idea that a Persian soldier deserved the same respect as a Greek one. Alexander didn't back down. He threw a banquet, a massive, absurd, theatrical banquet, where he seated Macedonians and Persians at the same table, in the same positions of honor, and prayed publicly for partnership between peoples. In the 4th century BC. Think about that. So what was actually driving him? There are two forces you have to understand, and they're pulling in opposite directions, in which is exactly why he was never at peace. The first is pathos, that word again. Greek philosophers used it to describe a specific kind of desire, not want, not ambition, but a gravitational pull toward the unknown, toward the thing that exists just past the edge of what you can see. Every time Alexander reached a new border, pathos kicked in. Not satisfaction, not rest, the compulsive, almost physiological need to see what was on the other side. His soldiers called it madness. His historians called it genius. But let's be real, it's the same mechanism. The engine doesn't care what you call it. The second force is something he inherited directly from Homer, from Achilles. Alexander didn't just admire Achilles the way you might admire a sports star. He modeled his entire life on the man. He visited Achilles' tomb at the start of his campaign and ran around it, naked, anointing the stone. And the lesson he took from Achilles wasn't, be the strongest. It was darker than that. It was, a short life of full intensity beats a long life of careful nothing. In his mind, baked in from childhood, safety was the real death. A man who hedged his bets, who protected himself, who chose the comfortable path, was already rotting, already a ghost. The extreme risk wasn't recklessness, it was philosophy in action. Now here's where it gets practical. Because Alexander didn't just believe these things, he built a personal framework for measuring whether he was living up to them. And that framework had nothing to do with territory, nothing to do with gold or titles or the size of his army. The measure was intensity of experience. Was he fully in it? Was he present, exposed, at the edge of what a human being could endure? Mentally, physically, philosophically? If yes, he was alive. If no, he was wasting the one resource that doesn't refill. He tested this constantly. Before major campaigns, he gave away his personal wealth. A general asked him what he'd kept for himself. Alexander said, "Hope." That's not a line from a motivational poster. That's a man who genuinely built his psychology around the idea that comfort is a trap. Ask yourself honestly, and this is the uncomfortable part, what percentage of your decisions in the last month were made from hope versus protection? From extension versus retreat? Because Alexander's framework doesn't grade on a curve. Now we push this to its breaking point, because the logical conclusion of everything Alexander believed leads somewhere terrifying. If a short, intense, fully lived life is the highest form of existence, then the content of your life, the specific texture of your days, including the losses, the humiliations, the grief, has to be not just tolerated but embraced, chosen, owned completely. Nietzsche would later formalize this as the eternal recurrence, the thought experiment where you ask yourself, if I had to live this exact life, every moment of it, infinitely, would I say yes? Alexander never read Nietzsche, obviously, but he was already living inside that question. Every brutal decision, every city that burned, every friend he lost or betrayed, every night sleeping on frozen ground when he could have stayed in a palace, he chose all of it. Not reluctantly, deliberately. That's the part that doesn't fit the bloodthirsty warlord narrative. Monsters don't agonize. Alexander agonized constantly. He just kept going anyway. But here's the thing about building your entire psychology around relentless forward motion. It works. Until something stops you from moving. Alexander's generals stopped him at the Hyphasis River in India. They wouldn't go further. After 12 years, they were done. And for possibly the first time in his life, Alexander faced something his philosophy had no answer for, the limit that comes from other people. He went to his tent. He stayed there for 3 days. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. When he came out, he turned back. That moment, that 3-day silence, is the most honest portrait of the man. Not the victories, not the speeches, that tent, that stillness. A man whose entire operating system was built around motion, suddenly unable to move. The philosopher in him understood. The conqueror in him couldn't survive it. The end comes fast and it comes ugly. At Babylon in 323 BC, Alexander's closest companion, his childhood friend, his general, the man historians believe was the emotional center of his life, Hephaestion, died of fever. Alexander's response wasn't grief, it was dissolution. He ordered a period of mourning so extreme that his advisors panicked. He stopped eating, he drank harder. He ran the kind of military campaign a man runs when he's not trying to win anything. He's just trying to stay moving because stopping means feeling. He was 32 when his own body finally gave out. The exact cause still isn't certain. Fever, poisoning, alcoholism, maybe all three. Maybe just the accumulated damage of a body that had been pushed past its limits for a decade and a half. He was asked on his deathbed who should inherit his empire. His answer, and this is almost certainly real, was the strongest, or maybe, and some historians think this is closer, and he said, to the best. Either way, no name, no plan, no successor. For a man who built his life around the idea that the only way to truly live was to give everything, maybe leaving nothing behind was the most consistent thing he ever did. He wasn't a monster with a philosophy, he was a philosopher who couldn't stop. And the difference between those two things is exactly the length of a life he was never willing to make small.